Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Forum. We'll be soon celebrating a centennial, and I hope you'll be engaged with that. This is not only the home of the Institute of Politics, but the home of Maggie Williams. We're indebted to her good leadership, and this event is co-sponsored by the Center for Public Leadership, which I'm privileged to serve. This could not come at a more important moment. You know, we've not only had a revolution in the ways that we talk to each other through the internet and through all the other means, but we've had a dramatic turn now in the relationship between the press and the White House. That relationship has often been testy, often been adversarial. In recent days, it seems to have turned venomous. And we need to deal with that. We have a situation for the first time in my memory where I've often known, as Josh has, presidents and Jessica has, presidents who have been bitter by what they've read, but they've rarely expressed themselves so openly, and never have we had a president, to my knowledge, who has called the press the enemy of the people. Very tough, very tough. And we have now questions about what is truth and how important is truth to political discourse. So we have a lot of ground to cover tonight, and fortunately we have two wonderful guests to cover it. Josh Earnest, who's here on the stage, grew up in Kansas City, I believe. Big fan of the Kansas City Royals. You had a lot to celebrate in 2015, right?
That's true.
That's good. And he went to Rice University, and from there started getting into politics, but he started making his mark at the national level in the Obama campaign of 2008, when he became the communications director in Iowa, and that was a pivotal win, as you may remember. It's probably the victory that put him over the top in that election cycle. Josh won his spurs for that and was deployed by the campaign on many other fronts. And then he went to the White House on day one, and he left on the last day. He was there on the first day and left as the last day, working his way from deputy press secretary to press secretary in the last 2.5 years, where he won a reputation for being civil and being respectful and being helpful. The Politico, I believe it was, took a survey of journalists, and they rated him the best press secretary they'd ever worked with at the White House. So I think that says a lot about who he is. On the screen above us, joining us from her hometown of Los Angeles, is Jessica Yellin. She grew up in the Los Angeles area, and then she came here to Harvard as an undergraduate, and she not only graduated Phi Beta Kappa, but she was a graduation speaker for her class. She, like Josh, has been an articulate spokesperson for a lot of things ever since. Jessica first went to work in the Clinton White House for a brief stint before she got started in journalism, where she was a local reporter in Florida for NBC, ABC, and eventually she became the White House correspondent for ABC and Good Morning America. And from there was recruited by CNN, where she was the chief White House correspondent, and served there as a role. I had an opportunity to meet her beginning way back in the Clinton days, but I can just tell you she had a wide following across the country because she was articulate, she was tough, and she was fair-minded. She has left the active day-to-day journalism and is now gone back home to Los Angeles, where she is at the Annenberg School. You may remember that is a critical part of the University of Southern California. And she wrote a very thoughtful piece about cable, tough piece about cable news that had caused quite a stir in the New York Times a few weeks ago. And is now been finishing up a novel, her first novel, called Inside I Die a Little. And it's about a reporter. I don't know, Jessica, you might lead us off and tell us, Inside You Die a Little, where It wasn't that bad, was it? Tell us how journalism has changed over the years. What I'd like to do before we come to the elephant in the room is talk a little bit to set the table. How has journalism changed? What did Jessica experience about, and where's her head now in journalism? And then Josh, because he's been on the other side of this divide, and he had to work with dramatic changes in the press corps over the last 8 years before he was released and can live a little. Jessica, over to you.
Hi, David. So nice to be on with you. Josh, it's great to see you without a tie on. Relax. And I just want to say quickly, as a student, I used to go to the IOP and these events religiously, so it's really exciting for me to be on the other side here. Next time, hopefully in person. To answer your question, David, I take it back all the way to the Clinton White House. Mm-hmm. And when I graduated college, I came straight out of school and was an intern in the West Wing, working for Intergovernmental Affairs. And in those days, I remember there was a single TV in the corner. It was one of those big box TVs, and it sat on clear fish wire. And I would always say there were two things that could stop the room dead quiet. President Clinton walking into the room, or CNN, which was the only thing that played on that TV, broadcasting a story about the White House. And everyone would go dead silent and listen. In those days, there was a lot of sharing between White House officials and the media, because I believe the only time you could have a quick leak was if it was going to show up on that box on TV. So it was only if they talked to CNN reporters that White House officials felt something would get out quickly. But if they talked to a newspaper, if they talked to evening news, they'd have hours to add more context, to update and change. And so I think that created an environment where people were very sharing. Cut to my experience in the Bush White House, where we had email and people held back a bit more. Cut to my experience in the Obama White House, and it was changed radically. Because if I were to call Josh, and it's true, he was wonderful and affable and all that, but he knew that if he told me something, the minute the words came out of his mouth, I could be tweeting it out, and there was no taking it back. So that radically changed, I think, the amount that was shared with the press and the relationship. And it's led to a real tightening over time that's separate and apart from the dynamics we're seeing right now.
That's very interesting. Josh, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what Jessica is illustrating is the increased pressure that journalists were facing in covering the White House. And that was true even just in the 8-year window of my tenure in the Obama White House. When I started at the White House didn't have a Twitter feed. And there were outlets that presumably all of you read with some regularity, like BuzzFeed. Politico was just a couple of years old when we started. Huffington Post was still relatively new. These are all organizations that quickly grew into widely followed news-breaking organizations. And the challenge, I think, was not just that we had to deal with those new organizations that were sprouting up, but we had to deal with the journalists who had previously been there, who now were feeling the competition from all of these new young upstarts. And it basically turned just about every reporter that worked at the White House into a wire reporter. It used to just be that you would have the Associated Press and Reuters and Bloomberg, AFP occasionally, who would be filing minute-by-minute updates. But once everybody else has a website to maintain or blogs to maintain, all of a sudden everybody is a wire reporter. And then once you have Twitter, everybody is reporting live up to the second. To help people understand what's going on. So there's another tradition that used to exist at the White House that's sort of diminished, and it was something called the morning gaggle. And this is something that David and Jessica are probably more familiar with firsthand than I am, but even during the Clinton administration, there would be reporters who would come into the press secretary's office very early in the morning, 8:30 in the morning, to just get a firsthand sense of what the White House was focused on that day. It was a very low-key affair, a low-key engagement. And reporters did it because wire reporters at the AP wanted to update the wire with a quick reaction from the White House. And other reporters were just sort of interested in trying to understand what was on the White House radar screen. And it was useful for the White House because they could get a sense of what reporters were interested in that day too. They could sort of get a sense of the first rounds of questions. But there's a lot of nostalgia among the current White House press corps for the days of the morning gaggle. But it didn't make any sense for any White House to agree to those morning gaggles anymore because it's just a second briefing. People walk into a morning gaggle that used to be a laid-back affair where people are sipping coffee and listening to the press secretary. They now don't have time to bring their coffee with them because they got to have both thumbs free so they can tweet it. So that emphasis on speed and immediacy has increased the pressure and the competition among the White House press corps, and certainly has made it more challenging for White House officials to engage in that kind of environment, as Jessica suggested.
I'm wondering too, though, Jessica and Josh, about the briefing itself, how central the briefing is. I don't think people outside the White House understand, or the White House experience understand, how important a part of the day that is, both for the press and for the White House. And people are in the current White House press corps getting a little nostalgic for open briefings, televised briefings, which have disappeared. So how important is it, the briefing is it, and how important is it that it be open? Mike McCurry, a former White House press secretary, has actually challenged whether it's important to be open and have the TV cameras rolling every time. Jessica?
So I think it is crucial that it's open. And I also think that 95% of the time it's ridiculous. It's kabuki theater, it's all performance, you're performing for your bosses, they're performing for their bosses, it's just a game. But in that 5%, it becomes crucial, and here's why. First, especially in this moment, it is sometimes the only opportunity during the day for regular people, voters, to hear directly from the White House, to hear in their own words how they defend their positions. And so especially at a time when there's mistrust of the media, it is very important to both hear the White House's perspective and see their relationship with the press, see how they answer or dodge questions. So there's that. Secondly, there are crisis points when the White House wants to hide. And it's only because they're expected to come out in that daily briefing and not showing up would become a story itself that you get access. And I'll give you one example. It was during Hurricane Katrina. When Katrina hit, I was working at ABC News. They sent tons of reporters down to New Orleans that got in even before the military. And they were calling back and saying, these conditions are worse than Baghdad. And I'm not making that up. That's what people who'd come from Baghdad were saying. And we would call FEMA, we would call DHS, we would call around, and no one would take our calls. They would refer in a circle to other agencies. And we were being told, people are dying, you're the national media, do something. And I felt helpless. And the only opportunity I had to speak up and say what I'm saying to you was in that daily briefing. And they said, you're being dramatic, that's not fair. And I quoted the facts, and I showed who I called, and as a result, we got FEMA, and we got a little bit of response. That's the kind of day it matters.
I think that's a good example of a situation in which the briefing is a direct source of accountability. But look, I think what Jessica is saying is right, that in some ways the briefing is a little antiquated. The briefing was created for a time in which journalists and White House staffers weren't carrying around little devices and where they could communicate around the clock with minimal friction. So there were times where I was tempted to say, why do we have to do a briefing? If you have a question, why don't you just come up to my office and we'll answer it? Or why don't you just send me an email and I'll answer your question? But there's something that's symbolically important about the briefing. The idea that there is a senior member of the White House staff who the president designates as the person who will every day prepare himself or herself to go out and speak on camera, on the record, and answer any question that any journalist can come up with, and be in a position to defend or explain what the administration's position is. And we, in the Obama White House, we came to find this to be a really useful forum, both for a couple of things. The first is internally, inside the inner workings of the White House, we found that it actually forced a lot of people to make decisions internally. And David, that may be true of your experience too, that there would be a tendency for people when they're facing a real dilemma to try to put off the decision. But oftentimes we'd go to decision makers and say, I'm going out in front of the National Press Corps on live television in 30 minutes, what should I say? So we got to figure it out and we got to come to an answer and we're going to move forward. And that had a way of advancing some decision making and policy making inside the White House. But it also was a really useful forum for making reporters pay attention. There is a tendency in this environment where people are trying to get clicks and retweets to focus on the salacious and not as focus as much on the substance. So I would be happy to walk into the briefing room, even on days where there's a tough story, and say, you know what, guys, let's sit down, let's talk this through. Let's talk it out. Let's have a conversation. And I'll give you a persuasive case for why we're facing a tough situation and why we are approaching it in the right way. And so what I often found is that the days where the briefing was toughest was not when there was a tough story in the newspaper, because oftentimes if there's a tough story in the newspaper or a tough story on CNN the day before, then we could actually sit down and examine that issue. I would know that there would be tough questions that would be coming in. We could look at all sides of this story and we could formulate a persuasive case. The harder days of doing the briefing was when there wasn't that much prominent in the news. And it meant that reporters in some ways were left to their own devices. They could just ask about anything. And in some ways that was a little bit harder. That was a lot harder than walking in even on those days when there was a really tough story, because if we knew we could focus on that one story, then we could spend some time working through how to make a persuasive case that what we were doing was the right thing.
Yeah, I would offer an argument, and Roger Porter's here, and he is a great student and scholar of the presidency, that one side effect which hasn't been so helpful is all this, the rush to get things into print, the amount of leaks that go on and so forth, really sometimes rush the decision making inside the White House on very delicate issues that do require more deliberation. There are some decisions you don't want to make overnight. Can you imagine if the 13 days of Jack Kennedy, the famous time and the most pivotal time of his presidency and the most important set of decisions any president has made in the last 60 years or so in terms of war and peace. He needed that extra time. And had he not had the longer, you remember if you go back to the story of 13 days, they first made a decision as a group. The consensus inside was to bomb Cuba, openly bomb Cuba. And then they talked themselves out of that and came to a second. And then they had enough time to talk themselves into a second position, which was quarantine it. And we now know, had we bombed, we would have set off a nuclear exchange, because they had nuclear-tipped missiles on the ready to launch. In Cuba. And it has raised all sorts of questions about whether White Houses get so absorbed with trying to feed the beast, so to speak, that you can sometimes lose track of what's more essential.
Yeah. There's another example of this in the Obama, sort of an analogous example of this in the Obama White House. There was a famous incident in August of 2014. This was shortly after ISIL had made a dramatic advance across the desert in Iraq. Right. And President Obama was in the briefing room and was asked a question about the situation inside of Syria, that everybody had sort of recognized that ISIL was based in Syria, had made this aggressive move into Iraq. And the United States talked about the relationships that we had, or the president talked about the relationships the United States had in Iraq to confront the situation in Iraq. And a reporter said, well, what about the situation in Syria? And President Obama famously or infamously said at the time, well, we don't have a strategy for that yet. And this was mischaracterized by a number of the president's political critics as somebody who is totally unprepared to deal with the situation. What the president was actually saying is he was in the midst of working with his national security team, with intelligence professionals, with our diplomats to formulate a strategy inside of Syria. And just 2 weeks later, President Obama did authorize an aggressive military action against extremists inside of Syria that involved 7 other Muslim-majority countries in the region. That was critically important because ISIL was making the case that they were representing Islam in a fight against the West. But by having these military pilots from Muslim-majority countries flying alongside U.S. pilots and bombing ISIL targets, it undermined that narrative in a way that showed that it was actually the civilized world, including most of the Muslim world, against these extremists in ISIL. Also part of the package of those strikes were extremists inside of Syria who were not affiliated with ISIL, but were hoping to use the chaos inside of Syria to carry out strikes against the United States. And those strikes were disrupted because of those attacks too. So the president, because he was able to formulate an effective decision over a period of a few weeks, was able to keep us safe and do the right thing. But in a news cycle that was demanding action, he had to take his lumps.
Yeah, he sure did. Jessica, help us understand from your perspective there, 3,000 miles away, how have things gone off the tracks in the relationship between the president and the press, knowing that it is always testy? How has it gone so far off the tracks in your judgment in the first half of 100 days in the Trump administration? We're halfway through the first 100 days, can you imagine? we have ways to go. Yes, please.
So my perspective on this is there has been a lot of fantastic reporting by a lot of reporters in Washington since the election, or in the first 100 days. And they're under a lot of pressure, and I want to acknowledge that. I think that there is a real challenge because when the president is attacking the media the way he is all the time, it's very easy for the media to get sort of self-focused and talk about themselves, talk about he's calling us fake news, he's going to war with us, and get distracted from the fundamental duty, which is to cover America and to teach us about ourselves and to teach us about our world. So I think that there are two questions here. One is Donald Trump and how he is strategically playing this issue with the press for his own advantage. It is to, I think, excite his base. It is sort of WWF media edition. In one corner, Donald Trump, defending the anti-institutionalist position, fighting the elites. In the other corner, the media defending their honor. We all know that conflict is what does well with readers, with viewers. And so it's very easy for the press to fall into focusing on that conflict. And I think that it is completely legitimate for them to be talking about, it is unacceptable for him to ice out CNN or the New York Times or any institution from a gaggle. Not okay. But we've also seen that when he does that, like he eliminated the Washington Post from the campaign trail, he turns right around and then grants them an exclusive interview a week later. I mean, he's the most fickle person, right? He changes his mind. So I think there's a danger in over-obsessing on the attacks that he makes on the media and letting that become a distraction from some of the implications of his policies. And, for example, the deportations, what's happening with jobs, the real issues in America.
And do you agree with that? The self-absorption by the press is a problem in all of this?
Yeah, but that's not new. I mean,
Well, you just feeding,
just
baiting people.
I am friends with lots of journalists, and I got to know them working at the White House.
Yeah.
But the institution of journalism is for an institution that is focused on offering their critique of people in power is remarkably thin-skinned. And we have seen President Trump cynically try to use that tendency of the press to defend themselves and to bristle at criticism to try to distract from tough questions that the media is asking him. And the good news is I think that even in 6 weeks here, or less than 50 days, that the news media is doing a better job of not getting distracted. And I think that is going to be a really important thing moving forward, that we know that this is a classic strategy that President Trump used to great effect on the campaign trail. It hasn't been as effective as I think he would like it to be in the White House, which is that when he's under fire, he looks for ways to say something outrageous about the media or about President Obama to try to distract from the tough line of questioning that he's currently sustaining. And we had a hallmark example of that over the weekend when he suggested that President Obama had ordered a wiretap of Trump Tower, despite the fact that no president has the authority to unilaterally order the wiretap of any American citizen.
Do you all worry at all about the First Amendment, and not that he's violating the First Amendment, but that he's violating the spirit of the First Amendment? That a robust free press serves all Americans, it makes the government more accountable, and that what he's doing is delegitimizing the press? Justin?
I do. I think that it must be called out. I think that what he's trying to do, we saw him try to delegitimize the intelligence community before he got into office. And then once he got into office, he really sped up on trying to delegitimize the press. It sure seems like he's making these attacks so that anybody who might criticize him is already seems suspect before these critiques come out. What I would say, though, is I don't think no one is losing the opportunity to speak out. Printing presses aren't being shut. Broadcast isn't being pulled. And they are being very outspoken. Appropriately, the media is being outspoken in defending and criticizing Trump for his attacks. So I'm not afraid that we're going to get there. What I do think we need to caution against is making that one of the only stories happening in Washington, and sustaining this focus on it. I think the best way for the press to prove its necessity is by doing what it does best: telling stories, explaining our world, investigating.
Please.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that President Trump has a grand ambition to try to erase the First Amendment from the copy of the Constitution in the National Archives. I think that he just often finds the First Amendment really, really inconvenient. And so there are times where when it becomes particularly inconvenient for him that he would just rather pretend that it doesn't really exist, and or that it's not that important, or that it is somehow malleable.
You think that's the road to authoritarianism? That's what a lot of critics
I think
would
it's
argue.
a possible road to authoritarianism, but I don't think that's what he has in mind, because his relationship with the media is pretty complicated. It is a gross oversimplification to suggest that somehow Donald Trump doesn't like the media. Donald Trump loves seeing his name in the media. He loves seeing his name in the headlines. He loves seeing his picture in the broadcast network news. He thrives on that, both in terms of his own sense of self, but also because it has accrued to his political benefit too. So his relationship with the news media is more complicated than that. He doesn't want the news media to just go away. He just wants them to be nice to him. But that's not their job. It is the responsibility of journalists to be skeptical, to be suspicious, to ask probing questions, to hold people in power accountable, and to hold people in positions of authority accountable for the way that they wield that authority. And that's something that, as a businessman, he's not comfortable with. He's used to being the CEO who calls the shots and everybody walks away and does what he says they should do. And so this is going to be in a period of an adjustment to him. And the First Amendment is inconvenient sometimes. But the success of our way of life and our institution of government depends on a commitment to the strict protection of it.
What about his relationship to the truth?
Similarly complicated.
Similarly complicated, yes, I agree. But I this morning at 7 o'clock, or shortly after 7 o'clock, the president began sending out tweets, relying on what was on Fox and Friends. And over the course of the next 2 hours, sent out 6 tweets responsive to Fox and Friends. And in one of those, the first one, what set him off was a report about people who had been released from Guantanamo, how many had re-engaged in terrorist acts, violent acts. And he picked up casually on what was said and said there have been 122 people released by Obama, who have committed these terrible acts. What a terrible decision was made by President Obama. And it turns out that Fox did not report that. They reported 122, but it turns out 93% of the 122 were released under George W. Bush. So here we have yet another smear of President Obama, which is sort of, I mean, can the press sort of sit there and casually say, well, there he goes again? Or is there something to call him to account? And I'm going to give Roger Porter the floor here because he's worked for Republican presidents and possibly has a different perspective. But I want to clear, Roger, we'll hold on until we get to questions. But can you all respond to that? Because I think that is as troublesome as the relationship with the press.
I agree. To me, this is more problematic than his critiques of the press, which I think are kind of staged for attention. I think the fact that we have a president who sometimes doesn't seem that informed about our history and doesn't seem to embrace the same values that a lot of us believe America has stood for since Ellis Island opened, and doesn't necessarily embrace the same facts that we all do, is problematic. And I think that one of the dangers in the press is never wanting to upset people to such an extent that we're unwilling to say, this is verified. We have this from 4 different sources. Here's the math. Here are the numbers. We stand by this. When you do that, you will piss off some people, excuse my language. And sometimes people in the media don't want to piss off anybody because they want to get as many viewers or as many readers as possible. And what's crucial is that they're willing to stand for those facts and for what is, I don't call it truth, I call it verified information, actual information, right? We can all debate what is truth. And I think that we've seen since the president has taken office, a much greater willingness on the part of the electronic press and print press to actually stand for these verified facts and be willing to take incoming in order to hold the line and say, you know what, this is a common body of knowledge, and if the president's outside it, we're going to have to deal with that, but we stand for this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Look, this is a difficult question about how you insist that the president of the United States actually rely on facts, and it's a stark departure from where we were under President Obama. That President Obama relished the opportunity to be able to marshal evidence and make a forceful case rooted in rationality about why what he was doing was the right thing to do for the country. And I do think that it is a sign of a lack of conviction. Mm-hmm. That if you have to make up facts to substantiate your case, you may not have that much confidence in the case that you're trying to make.
Yeah.
But look, again, we know this tactic from Trump. Yeah. It's familiar, right? That when he's under pressure, let's go out and distract by saying something outrageous or blaming President Obama. He previously had suggested that President Obama is the one that is orchestrating these protests at Republican congressmen town halls. Actually, I think those are people who are just mad that Republicans are about to take their health care away. In some ways, it's a pretty simple explanation about what's happening. That's true in red states and blue states, and that's true of people who voted for Donald Trump, by the way, which is why it's, I think, particularly troubling to them.
Tell us, before you went out and briefed, how carefully you had to make sure that you had the facts straight. Yeah. How important was that?
It was critically important. There are a lot of times where I would be prepping for the briefing, where somebody would come and say something to me, and I would say, that doesn't sound right. I don't think that's true. Go back and check and make sure that that's right. I don't want to be in a position where I'm saying something that's not true. One of my biggest pet peeve, people often ask me this, what is your biggest pet peeve at the briefing when somebody asks you a tough question or if they raise their voice? Actually, my biggest pet peeve of the entire briefing, it was fine with me if people wanted to raise their voice or wanted to ask me a tough question. My biggest pet peeve was if somebody included false information in their question. Primarily because that's a really hard thing to answer, because you both have to refute the premise and answer the question. But the thing that irritated me more than anything else is those people were sitting in those chairs listening carefully to everything that I was saying, prepared to pounce on any sort of misstatement or falsehood that I uttered. And they do that even though I don't know what questions are coming in advance. But they, on the other hand, have an opportunity to sit back, script out their question in advance, and if they're so lazy to include false information on that was actually the one time that I would feel myself getting riled up in the briefing, is if I was having an entire conversation with a reporter based on something false they had said. But this is something that we took very seriously, and there has been a little more coverage recently of the Trump White House not doing as many televised briefings, right. And I know that one of my predecessors, Mike McCurry, is a big advocate for at least reducing the presence of television in the briefing room, because that detracts from the kind of environment in which the question and answers take place, and people have a tendency to play to the cameras. But I think what's also a bad look is to leave people with the impression that somehow you don't have enough confidence in the case that you're making, that you're prepared to walk out in front of the cameras and make it. So I relish the opportunity that I had, if there's a tough story, to go out there and defend it, mm-hmm. and to go out there and be able to present a counter case.
Yeah, but you often had to play reporter within the White House too, to find out what the truth was.
Yes, absolutely. To do some digging and to find out where things started, or sort of where we were in the process, or to get some fidelity to what the White House approach was to solving a tough problem.
Right. And Jessica, because I think it's so important to have these kind of understanding of what the standards have been. When you were active in journalism, how important it was for you to get the facts straight?
Oh, essential. I mean, your entire credibility would be shot. If somebody could do a piece that you've worked on forever and have one fact wrong, and somebody will point to that one fact and say, well, obviously, if she couldn't get that right, it discredits the whole thing. So you try to be as accurate as you can be. And sometimes that means, taking more time, qualifying as best you can. So yes, that was crucial. I would say, though, that because of speed and because of the environment, we move further and further from asserting facts. Like there's this fear I might get it wrong, so I'm just not going to put it in, is what I saw happening a lot. I won't put in the number, what the tax reform bill will be, because this side will dispute it and that side will dispute it, so I'll just leave the number out. And this is one of the reasons that news viewers are getting less information. We're unwilling to stand for, and take the heat sometimes. I would like to say this just for the record, because while it was a wholly different environment, it's not like there weren't issues before too. When the Obama White House came out and said that President Obama is evolving on gay marriage, that was spin, right? So every White House, that was not a hard fact, in my opinion. I think that they had a political strategy and they were playing out their political strategy, and we all played this game. So there's always been an element of the game in the briefing. I also was frustrated as a reporter there that I wasn't given more access to policy people who were making decisions to brief me on deep background about what was going on in their thinking about the decisions. That was something the Bush White House did all the time and the Obama White House did very infrequently. That was a challenge for me. But, so those were the kinds of issues we grappled with then. Compare that to, the press is the enemy of the people. It's a difference in magnitudes.
Terrific. Let me ask you all one last question, and then we're going to go to the floor. And that is, you and I talked about a little bit about this afternoon, Josh. One silver lining, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, is there a silver lining in the way you see the younger generation in particular, but the country in general, responding and the resilience that you're seeing in the country? You have a pretty sunny disposition anyway, but are you impressed by what you're seeing? Do you think it's different?
I think there is cause for optimism, and the reason for that is, Jessica made an allusion to this. We're seeing newspaper circulations are going up. We're seeing viewership of television news is increasing, and I think that's undeniable that some of these political conversations are more present in our day-to-day lives, for better or worse. In some cases, it's a source of conflict and friction in our lives, but at least it's there. And when we are moving in a direction of a more engaged citizenry, that can only be good for the country. We're only going to make better decisions if more people are involved, if more people are showing up to vote, if more people are engaging in conversations about which direction the country or their community should go in. That's only a good thing. And there was this panic in the early days of the Obama administration about the future of the news business. People were wondering if there was a future for the news business. And there were concerns about whether or not they were going to be able to print enough newspapers to support a staff, and if people would pay to read the New York Times online. Turns out lots of people, hundreds of thousands of people are paying to read the New York Times online. That is a really good thing. And I think, if anything, the effect of the Trump presidency over the last 6 weeks has been to increase the attention and interest in those things. And the other thing that is, the other aspect of this that is a little less related to the media and a little bit more related to politics is elections matter. Voting matters. It has consequences. And sometimes that was a tough argument to make. Particularly to young people, even right before an election. Somehow I think I'm going to have a little easier time making that case before the next election. If I'm in that situation, I'm going to have a little easier time making that case, because I think people have a very vivid sense now that the outcome of elections have a profound impact on our lives.
Good. Jessica, if you were coming back as a student and you're about to give a graduation address to Harvard undergraduates, Harvard students, what plea would you make?
Getting informed is part of taking action. And you have to be smart about where you're getting your information. You have to be responsible about making sure we have an environment that you're supporting these institutions that are giving you the information. I really think passionately that it is the students in college today and the people who are in your audience right now who are going to figure out how to do the news of the future. I believe that if I ask for a show of hands, most students do not get their news from TV news, from cable news, or even necessarily by getting a newspaper, right? So it's digital. And the question is, how are they going to solve the problem of finding a way to finance these organizations in a way that the information is what's prioritized, not what gets clicks, not what gets eyeballs. And to me, this is as an important, it's a crucial part of our democracy. And I just urge people who are in the audience there to think about this and to consider, writing their papers on it, engaging in what does the news get wrong? How is it broken? And how can we fix it? And I really think that they're going to find the answer. I have a lot of ideas about it myself, but every time you go out and you talk to somebody, they ask, how can we monetize it? And I'm really, trusting the next generation to give us that answer.
Well, you've been arguing that corporate values have crept too far into news gathering, in effect, in the way the news is covered.
My view, and the reason I wrote that in an op-ed more or less, is to engage this conversation, a broader conversation about understanding how the news is broken and what are some of the other models. How else can we do it? If you look at what Bezos has done at the Washington Post, it's been nothing short of spectacular. And that's in a private for-profit environment. So it's not a critique of for-profit, but it's the idea that you're overseen by someone whose mission is very clearly truth first, or informing our viewers first and foremost, and that drives the institution. And it's not that those values aren't true in corporate environments. It just gets very mixed up when you also have this drive to do shareholder returns as number one. And I think that we should be having more of these conversations openly with less sensitivity and more sort of easy engagement, because it's important for the survival of the media.
Good. Thank you both. Okay, we're going to go to the floor, and the first person down, and there's a microphone back here, there's a microphone over here. Standard forum rules, one question per customer, and be brief, identify yourself, and every question ends with a question mark. But I promised we would go to Roger Porter first. Roger, as you've been listening to this, do you have some thoughts about sort of where we find ourselves today?
This has been a really rich and valuable discussion, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to hear the perspective of someone who has been in the battle recently, as Josh has, and someone who has covered this as successfully as Jessica has. The essence of a well-functioning democracy depends on an enlightened citizenry. And enlightened citizenry depends very heavily on people having access to information that they can trust and that they find is credible, so that they can make choices as to what paths they would like the country to pursue. One of the tasks of great presidents and great presidential administrations is that they establish credibility with the citizenry, and the way they do that is largely through their interactions with an aggressive press corps that hopefully is respectful, but that is in fact holding them accountable. This is not, in my experience, working inside 3 different White Houses, an easy task. Because from the standpoint of people inside the White House, particularly working in the policy part of the White House, which is where I worked, you are constantly wanting more of what Josh was referring to as more time to think something through clearly. People make mistakes when they do things in haste. They make mistakes when they haven't thought through all of the ramifications and consequences associated with various alternatives. And the people in the policy parts of the White House, including the president, need an environment in which they can change their minds and not be viewed as a flip-flopper or inconsistent or moving with the winds in one direction or another. So from the standpoint of people who are trying to shape sound policies that will withstand the scrutiny that they are going to receive, you want lots of time. From the standpoint of the press, they're in an incredibly, intensely competitive environment in which they are out there trying to get the story now, as much of it as possible, and will do everything that they can to satisfy their publishers and editors and others who are saying, what's the story and what can we report and write? So the tension that exists between the press and the president is unending. It was there when you and I had the opportunity to serve there, David. It's not going to change. With respect to that tension, is not going to go away. The tension is ameliorated, however, when the two parties, the press and the president, respect one another and trust one another, and each has established a level of credibility with one another. And one of the challenges that people have when they're in the position that Josh was in, where they're responding to this, is to pause and think it through before they're there in the moment and not do things quickly and rashly, because we've seen what happens when people do things quickly and rashly. They make mistakes, and then they've got to go back and try to rectify those mistakes. So I hope that all new administrations go through a challenging shakedown period, because there are people there who are doing their jobs for the first time. They're trying very hard. They want to succeed. They find it is more challenging than they thought it was going to be. So I am sympathetic to those who say, let's cut them a little slack. Sometimes that is made difficult by the kinds of behavior that one sees. But nonetheless, it seems to me that pushing toward having a credibility on the part of both the press and the White House is what our democracy really needs.
Terrific. Thank you, Roger. Professor Porter.
Can I say one thing? Just one quick thing to respond to that, and then we'll go to some other questions. But the thing that occurs to me as you were making that case, and I agree entirely, that the real tension is that there's a press corps that's demanding a story, and in a competitive environment trying to get to the bottom of the story. But here's the other thing that they're doing is they also are advocates for the American people. And in faced with a challenging situation, they're also demanding to know what the White House is going to do about it. And so I go back to the Syria example. The president was in a tough spot. It certainly was true that reporters wanted to be the first to report what the administration was going to do to confront the situation in Syria. But they also were advocates for the American people. They were agents of the American people saying, what are you going to do to solve this problem? Because we're a little freaked out by it. And so you have to find ways to buy some time. Because as you point out, you can't make decisions like this right away. So Jessica made reference to the frequent reference to the president evolving in his position on gay marriage. And that's actually, I think, a pretty good example of a situation where we weren't ready to make a decision. We weren't ready to make an announcement, but we needed to find a way to buy some time and create some space. And that is when a spokesperson, in many ways, is at the greatest point of discomfort. You're pulled in two different directions, so you're feeling that maximum tension. And so the trick is to find ways to be honest about what's happening, even if you're not ready to make an announcement yet. And that's why it's easier for somebody who's not the president to not say, well, we don't have a strategy yet, but to recite the long list of things that we are doing and to evaluate the different options that may be under consideration without making a declaration one way or the other. And the truth was, in terms of the president's evolution on gay marriage, that actually was a true statement, that we were in a position of moving from one position to another one. What would not have been a true statement is if the president had come out and said, I've always been for gay marriage. I don't understand what you people are talking about. So that would sort of highlight, I think, some of the difference. But the challenge that you put your finger on is definitely one of the most acute ones that any White House press secretary feels.
Terrific. You have the first question from the floor, sir.
Hello.
If you can identify yourself, off you go.
My name is Kyle McFadden. I'm a junior at the college currently. I'm originally from North Dakota, so I'm very familiar with the Middle America common sense people who largely elected President Trump. And I actually spent the weekend in Florida with my family. And as you know, President Trump tweeted out his claims about President Obama's wiretapping of his offices. And it was clearly a big event because it was something the president said and needs to be taken seriously, but something that my family and a lot of people that I know from that area really notice is they feel exhausted by the news coverage of it because to them it's so clearly false and ridiculous. But again, meanwhile, he is the president and what he says needs to be taken seriously. And so this question might be more relevant for Ms. Levin as a journalist, but where is the balance between reporting on what the president is saying when what he's saying is just laughably false?
David, should I take that?
Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, Jess, go ahead.
So it's a great question. I am of the view that we have an obligation to report his tweets when they're about politics and policy and something relevant like that. Every president has a bully pulpit. It has never been more aptly named. And part of his bully pulpit is Twitter. So these are statements by the president, they should be covered. But like all statements, we should put proper context around them and use proper perspective. So when he says something as outrageous and unfounded as that, maybe the way to treat it is to treat it as one story out of other stories that are going on, not do a whole day of coverage on just that tweet and the drama around it. And I would submit that the media needs to be driving the coverage more than following the president. And I will give you an example of this. The president defined his campaign on immigration and jobs. I know there's recent McClatchy polling that shows 72% of Trump voters want a legal path to citizenship for illegal immigrants. 72% of Trump voters, 80% of all Americans. Why don't we see reporters day in and day out in the country, figuring out, talking to, finding out what is going on with deportations, with arrests, with the people who want to see a change in our immigration policy. What breaks through is the repetition, day after day after day. If we saw that in addition to a mention of his tweet, there would be a little more perspective. You would see that it's not everything. I'll give you one more example. The Carrier plant, he allegedly saved all these jobs in Indianapolis. That was the president's big push right away. Guess what? There's a plant 1.5 miles away called Rexnord, where they're shipping 350 jobs to Mexico. I saw a mention of this in USA Today. NPR did a story. I do not see that kind of story day after day after day in the TV press. And those are the kinds of stories that I think the media has more of an obligation to start covering, and it'll put some of the president's sort of zany tweets into a relative context, and you'll see that that's not a true reflection of what his administration is really doing. It's not the whole picture.
Just let me follow quickly with that.
Yeah.
What if in the newsroom that you're working in, there are questions about the mental stability of the president? And he tweets out something like that. Where do you go with it? I mean, does that mean you ought to give it more attention because it's sort of like, where did that come from? And what are we dealing with here? Or I'm just curious, when does that come into play? Because there's a lot of conversation quietly going on in the country about that issue, but nobody really wants to, in fairness to him, and to go to Roger's point, they need to have time to settle in. They need to cut, you need to cut them some slack a little bit to get in here. But there are questions that are on people's minds.
Well, I keep waiting for them to have the Gergen moment, which is, remember, Bill Clinton had a real rocky start, and then they said, we need to get somebody in here who knows what they're doing. and they brought you in and you figured things out a little bit and smoothed things out. So I'm waiting. I feel like Trump is going to eventually have to say, we need somebody who knows how the system works to
Well,
stabilize.
the answer to Bill Clinton was let Clinton be Clinton. It was to provide a safe environment where he could become more himself. I'm not sure that's the answer in this case.
So to answer your question, of course you cover that tweet. And of course one raises the questions, where is this coming from? What is motivating this? Is this even strategic? All of that. And it's also fascinating and riveting to discuss. So I'm not going to pretend this isn't there's part of this where you do need to capture your audience. I'm just advocating for a little more perspective, context, and I think to your specific question about mental sanity, the way to get at that is if there are senators who are worried about that, if there are individuals who are stakeholders who will speak to that, that is the way to get at it. You don't hire some, doctor from down the street to come on and diagnose.
Well, I totally agree with that. And, it is a more question of temperament than anything else. And which is an issue that's been in this conversation now, going back to the beginning of the campaign. And temperament is important in a president. It's not, FDR famously had a wonderful temperament to be a good president. And it made a big difference. Yes, sir, let's go here.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Bobbs, and my question is, you made the comment that when you live broadcast the press meeting, it causes people to play to the camera sometimes. And I was wondering if a similar phenomenon develops when you have C-SPAN live streaming Senate confirmation hearings and other meetings of Congress where no real discourse or question and answer is going on, it's just people performing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There are clearly senators who have tried to make their reputation and fill their campaign coffers by colorfully questioning the people who've come before the committee. No doubt about that.
Please. Yes, sir.
Hi, Howard Cohen, a first-year student at HKS. The press secretary under the Trump administration has been featured on SNL comedy shows and late-night TV shows. How does a press secretary reply to these types of skits? And do you have a particular take on what we've seen on the late-night shows?
Yes.
Well, you're fresh off Colbert, right?
That's right. Well, first of all, in those situations, it's important to be able to show a little sense of humor, right? You got to show that you're in on the joke a little bit. And while I was not caricatured or lampooned in quite the same way on Saturday Night Live, there were a couple times where there were clips of my briefing on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, where Jon Stewart did the exaggerated palm to forehead movement to mock something I had said. So look, when you are in a position that's that visible, taking some lumps and being the butt of a joke or two is part of the territory. And look, doing a job like this where you are so central to the scrutiny of what's happening at the White House, you have to develop a little bit of thick skin. The more serious way in which I found this challenging is that the thing that I often found frustrating is if people asked me about something that wasn't sort of headline news that day, but was some element of the news, and I wasn't aware of it, it was reported as if the White House and everybody who worked there was completely unaware of it. And there was one occasion in which Fox News had been covering a story. I don't quite remember all of the details, but it involved, I believe it was a young either military service member or a veteran who was back at home and had been tragically, legitimately tragically, the victim of a grisly murder. And there were questions that were raised about whether this individual had been, I think the suggestion was that there was an illegal immigrant that was in custody for committing the murder. And the Fox News reporter raised his hand and said, what do you think of the story of Sergeant so-and-so? And I said, excuse me? What are you talking about? And he said, you haven't heard about the murder of Sergeant so-and-so, a decorated Marine Corps veteran in Oklahoma? And so it was an illustration of just how challenging this job can be. And it is easy to poke fun at sort of the trials and tribulations of doing this job, but there's so much that is projected onto you when you are in this role, that you are sort of symbolically speaking for the White House, that it can be a lot of pressure. And certainly in the instance that I described, it requires you to cast a wide net of making sure that you're prepared. But it also means that when people are offering up a caricature of you, it isn't always just about you. It is about sort of a broader caricature about what's happening at the White House. And like so many other things, you're a symbol. And he clearly is in the context of that portrayal on Saturday Night Live.
I have the impression that you really enjoyed the job.
I loved the job. And it was an incredible blessing to have the opportunity to do it. I was humbled to do it. I found it to be such a unique and special opportunity to advocate for a president and a vision for the country that I deeply believed in. It gave me a sense that I could, in some ways, a really real way, fight for things that I believed in. And now that fight was not taking place on a battlefield. That fight was taking place in a contest of ideas. And I found that incredibly invigorating. I found it very stimulating, and I found it very rewarding. And I never took for granted what a special opportunity it was, that the platform where I was standing is one that, look, most members of Congress don't have. And so that was really a special thing. And I was aware that I was advocating for somebody else's values and somebody else's vision. And I was working for a president of the United States that I believed in. And I never got confused about who was front and center. But I was pleased to have a chance to leave my own imprint on it. And to, one of the things that is so challenging about the job is you answer to so many masters. You've got journalists who are demanding answers. You've got a president and other senior staffers in the White House who are demanding that you make an argument in a certain way. And it can be challenging to try to serve all of those masters. It's such a big job that you can lose yourself in it. And it's why my sense is that the people who are the best at it and the people who are most likely to be successful are the ones that are really grounded, the ones that are really centered, the ones who really know what it is that they believe in. They have a set of values, a certain set of core values that they're not going to compromise on, and they use that as a platform from which to make arguments and to serve the president and to serve the interests of the press corps and to be responsive to their questions. And that's what I tried to bring to the job, and having the opportunity to do it is something that I found to be the opportunity of a lifetime and found to be an incredible blessing. I don't wish that I was doing it right now, but the 2.5 years that I had an opportunity to do that work is as a rewarding and professional opportunity as I've ever had.
Terrific. Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name's Ben. I'm a second year at the business school. Part of what I see as the problem surrounding media right now is that the population is sort of really self-segregating when it comes to their sources. And as a result, fake media has sort of through certain traditional routes as well as non-traditional routes like Facebook and Twitter really found an audience, really found an installed base that believes it and doesn't believe the New York Times, doesn't sort of believe the more traditional spots. So given that it's so entrenched and it's finding oxygen from these sources, how do we take on fake news and how do we sort of limit their influence in a world in which they don't want to believe us?
Jessica, why don't you respond to that?
I think part of it is mechanics. So, Facebook is moving to find ways to identify stories from questionable sources. But I also, and to see more platforms do things like that, I think that'll start to be part of our future. But I also have friends who put out stories and they say somebody will stamp it fake news immediately, even though it's from a completely reliable source. So in part, we have to find ways to start talking to each other, right? And I think that one of the fundamental breakdowns is going back even further. It's not just that people they're mistrustful of the media. They don't understand the basics. Nobody's explaining the basics, and so they don't therefore believe the stories we're telling them. For example, when I was a baby reporter and I first started, my job was always to do the setup piece. The setup piece is they're going to have David Gergen on and Gloria Borger to explain what's going on on Congress over healthcare reform. But I would do that piece that explains what's in the bill. Here are the basics. Here's what's going to change. Here's how much it will cost. That setup piece was the fact that informed you. Those setup pieces don't happen as often anymore. Sometimes they don't happen at all. And instead of having David Gergen and Gloria Borger having a reasoned, informed discussion, you have 12 pundits on panels paired off to create the maximum fireworks who just create a lot of noise. And so I think one of the reasons people are so skeptical of the news and mistrustful of the news is because it's just coming at them like noise. And they're not getting the fundamental understanding of the issues that the news used to provide them. I had a friend whose English wasn't their first language, and she used to say, explain me, Yassi, explain me the story. And I feel like we're not explaining people well enough anymore. What is the basic Russia story? What is the basic ACA story? If we did that better and in a way that connected with people, I bet you there would be less mistrust of the media and more ability to read other points of view.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're going to take time for a few more questions. We're going to stop.
Hi, my name is Sonia, and I'm a graduate student. And we've heard President Trump criticize and demean not just people and organizations, but institutions, and for example, the CIA. And that has affected some in the institution and their morale, where we've seen a CIA analyst resign. How does that impact journalists and their morale and their reporting if they keep getting the same treatment, and when they're there, for example, in a press briefing, are they going to hold back a little bit because they're now either too much pressure on this job to question the president because they don't want to attract attention? And is that going to make them, A, not do their job as well, or B, a lot of journalists say that this is not the profession I want to be in at this time?
It's a good question. I think that they're under a lot of pressure. It's really stressful. And it's hard to be there under any circumstances. I mean, whether you're on Josh's side inside the White House or on the press side, you live in permanent fight or flight. You're on adrenaline 24/7 until you leave that job. And so, and you know you're always going to be attacked and criticized, and everyone's watching. And so to add this layer of antipathy and vitriol to it is very difficult. That said, I'm unbelievably pleased and cheered to see how these news organizations are standing by the reporters. And because so many reporters know that their organizations have their back, I think that gives them a lot of freedom to do their job. And, you know, that's not always the case, but in this moment, it really is. And people are being told, you know, go get the information. It's not about access. You know, take the story where the story goes. And so I actually think that there's actually some good morale because they actually feel like they're doing something meaningful that matters and not chasing silly little stories. And it's just important that management continues to stand behind reporters and continues to get their back no matter what the White House does down the road.
Great. Please.
Hi, my name is Samantha Joseph, and I'm a mid-career student here and a fellow at the Center for Public Leadership. I had a question, you know, as we saw President Trump made the accusation towards President Obama, and I was curious to hear your thoughts on how do former presidents advocate for themselves after they leave office, if at all? You know, what is
they
their
normally don't have to.
Yeah, normally, but so what does their public life look like after the presidency, and who acts as a spokesperson for them?
Yeah. Well, President Obama does have a personal office. It's much smaller than the team of people that he had working for him at the White House, but he's got a team of people who are there to help him in his post-White House transition. He's obviously got some big plans. Mm-hmm. But you know, that includes some people who are on his staff who are talking to reporters every day, who are chasing down the facts about about the process that we use to review Gitmo detainees to make sure that they didn't re-engage in the fight, mm-hmm. and the success of that program. So there are people that are on his staff. There are other people like me who are interested observers in that process and do have, I have my own interest in doing what I can to advocate for his legacy and to ensure that we're setting the facts straight with regard to Obamacare or Gitmo or even some of the policies with regard to, or what the truth is, with regard to wiretapping. So, it's a multi-layered approach. What President Obama has said is that he is hopeful that he can observe the tradition that previous presidents have observed, which is to try to move away from the stage, give the new president the opportunity to ascend the stage and to lead the country without constantly being the subject of a critique from the guy who just left the stage. This is something that President George W. Bush actually did with an extraordinary amount of class. It's not as if the Obama administration was particularly complimentary of his tenure in the White House. That was certainly true during the campaign, but that was also true during the early stages of President Obama's presidency when we talked about the situation that President Obama had inherited. But yet, to his credit, President Bush himself didn't feel the need to come back out and speak. Now, there were other senior members of his administration, including his vice president, who had some very caustic things to say. So it's not as if his views weren't well represented or there weren't people out there advocating for him. But I think President Obama, all other things being equal, would love to go off and to hang out with Richard Branson or do whatever else he's going to do in his post-presidency. But if there's a need to set the record straight, then the people who are on his staff and those of us who spend a lot of our lives working on these issues are going to be using whatever platform we have remaining to set the record straight.
Thank
Good.
you.
Last question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Aaliyah Braley. I work at HKS and I'm an alum of the Divinity School here. I wanted to ask, do you think it's possible that actually the policies that Trump is enacting are less overall lasting and corrosive to democracy than the norms that he's breaking by the flagrant falsities that he's saying? And specifically, the question is, if you can entertain that notion, what can the press do other than just saying that's not true? Because the president still said it. And do you think that the fact that the president still said it and he's still president and got away with it is still extremely corrosive to our democracy? And where does the First Amendment and the president kind of part ways?
Thank you. Jessica.
I think the best thing for the press to do is report our world and show the truth. Leave the bubble, leave the studio, and get out there and show Americans what's really happening in this country. And those stories will demonstrate where the truth lies, what is factual. So having an endless squabble with the president, he's lied again, he's lied again, he's lied again. I think it becomes noise and it becomes something very easy to tune out. What people won't tune out are real stories about their country. And if we do a better job of showing them their own worlds and explaining the changes, literally the impact of his policies on real communities, that will speak for itself. That is much more powerful than another pundit debate calling out the president for distorting some fact on a tweet. Because the squabbling is forgettable, but a real story from a real community sticks with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that, and I think that is exactly I think that is definitely going to be an important part of the recipe as the media determines the right way to sort of adapt to the environment that they're facing now. I think there's one other thing that they will have to incorporate, and in some ways I think this may be a good way to end, which is that one of the critiques that I certainly had as press secretary was a frustration about the intense focus in the media on conflict. Jessica alluded to this earlier, that there were often times where I was working in the White House where we were advocating a policy where there was more intense focus in the coverage on the critique of the policy and the criticism that the policy was drawing from Republicans and in some cases Democrats than on the actual policy itself. And some of that is a function of the media environment that we currently operate in, right? That the colorful criticism or the colorful takedown is the thing that gets attention, particularly if it can be contained in 140 characters or less. And what we have to do is to ignore the connection between that phenomenon in our media and Donald Trump's election as President of the United States is to deny some very basic facts about the tone of the current political debate in this country over the last decade. So one of the things I think that we're going to have to evolve on is how do we have more reasoned debates? Not just factual, but how do we get to a place where we can have an honest, reasoned debate that's rooted in our common ground? And maybe that is, that's an idealistic notion. I'm sure that's what the presidents of the cable television networks would tell me. But in some ways, we have to create space in our media for that. But the other thing that we have to do is we've got to create space in our own lives for that. As we're having conversations with people, we're not going to persuade people by talking down to them, by saying that they are unsophisticated or leaving with the impression that we think that they're stupid because they voted for Donald Trump. We need to find a way that we can find some common ground with people, even if they disagree with us, and be able to make a case and start a dialogue that isn't just rooted in I'm right and you're wrong and here are all the colorful ways I can illustrate to you why you're wrong. We need to change the way that this debate operates, and we need to find a way that, and again, I recognize that that's not going to make for boffo primetime cable news ratings, but at least we can have a news media that supports that kind of debate and that kind of dialogue in communities across the country. And one of the things that I know that television networks are doing is they're actually doing more coverage of town hall meetings. They're creating situations where real citizens will ask people in a position of authority a tough question, and then they'll give them plenty of time to answer it. And I think that's not going to be the only answer, but that certainly is part of supporting the kind of reasonable, measured, respectful dialogue that we need to have in this country, and we need to find a way to create some space for it. And so much of that got crowded out, I think, by shouting on cable TV and by salacious news, fake and otherwise. That it became too easy to just talk about, like, oh my goodness, can you believe it? Barack Obama wasn't actually born in the United States. That crowded out space for us to have a much more reasoned conversation about what President Obama was doing. And as Jessica was talking about how the next generation of journalists is going to have to spend some time thinking about how to monetize good journalism and how to capitalize on some of the benefits of social media and doing that journalism. I hope this is another area where young people, smart people, savvy people can spend some time thinking about what can we do to foster a more constructive, healthy debate in this country, because ultimately our democracy and our country will benefit from it.
Jessica and Josh, at a time when there's so much of our discourse seems poisonous and venomous, we thank you both for helping us remember what constructive, reasoned conversation can be like. It was a wonderful evening. Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Bye, Jessica.
Thank you.
That's terrific. I really enjoyed it.